Hey, inspired adventurer, and welcome back to the Artificial DM. So, we've covered quite a few RPG horror stories recently, and you guys have been requesting some glory stories. So I went ahead and I picked out a few of them. So sit back, relax, and enjoy some RPG glory stories. Before I get into the first story, I have a little bit of explaining to do. So some of you may remember the Ross stories. It's actually one of the first few stories that really blew up on the channel. And yes, OP was a butthole, but I feel the main reason that he still resented Ross was because that Ross wasn't just a that guy in-game. Ross was a that guy in his personal life. If you read through a few of the comments that OP put on his stories, you find out that Ross stole from him, re-signed a lease that OP didn't want to sign, was a slob, and overall, a really bad roommate. Basically a neckbeard. There's some other nonsense, but I'm not going to cover it all. I'm not getting into everything. This is a glory story, and I'm going to tell you why. Reddit user Dark Sage Aura actually reached out to me. He also reached out to Crit Crab, and he had a response to the Ross saga. This is from Ross. Well, hello there. You may have noticed someone is rezzing comments on the Ross saga. Well, I actually just found out about them yesterday, Japan time. It's hard not to know who the OP was if you know what signs to look for. The Dreadlord tattoo, Serpent World Inn, or the Drider girlfriend. Heck, what really gave it away was the names he dropped. I don't know if you guessed it, but I'm the one who made those posts on Crit Crab's The Ross Saga. I am Ross. Well, I just wanted to say, don't go hating on the OP of those stories. I was a handful. I was socially and emotionally stunted and naive. I really didn't know how to handle disappointment. For those of you who thought I might have been on the spectrum or have ADD, I have often wondered that myself. I honestly don't know, because I will admit I do get tunnel vision when I set my mind to something. Funny thing is, that's how I got through university. I will say something about my past though. When I was younger, I did need to take speech therapy. And I did need to take special classes to help build up my gross motor skills. Coming from the background I did come from, I was always put down. So it was hard for me to trust anyone. And when I did actually open up and trust someone, I clung, and I clung hard. So I will admit that I was partially to blame for driving OP of the Ross saga insane. But I wasn't all to blame, and no, I won't go into any details. Crit Crab, if you want to read this on stream as a final episode to the Ross saga, go right ahead. I just wanted to let people know I'm in a better place emotionally and somewhat socially than before. There are days, I admit, I do still feel sorry for myself, but those days are few. By the time I quit D&D with OP and friends, I was in university, almost done. Then I graduated. Got a job in Japan teaching English. I was able to teach English at kindergartens and now elementary schools. I'm doing great. I have friends both online and in real life who gets me and don't judge me. I'm happy. Again, I'm in a much better place than I was. I couldn't watch all of the stories because hearing what he thought of me actually stings a bit, but I can laugh it off. Was I cringe? Yes. Was I stupid or an idiot? Maybe. But to be honest, I don't think I was. I was trying to play in character most of the time. Characters I had approved by the OP, I might add, and even changed when he said it wouldn't work. Edited some of this for grammar errors. Might still be, but I'm just sitting back, relaxing with a whiskey and coke. Update. I figure I should clarify something. I was by no means innocent either. I was a jackass to the OP, and I ended up doing some terrible things to him. While the OP did sound like an asshole, I can honestly say that he was a great guy, and I hope that whatever he posts about me does help him move past everything, so that he could be happy. Ross, if you end up hearing this, I'm very glad that you ended up finding yourself in a happier situation. We've all gone through a phase where we were cringe, or have made terrible choices, so I'm glad that you were able to learn from your mistakes and grow into who you've become today. Thank you, Ross, for reaching out to me. This story is sent in by Brett. Thank you for sharing your tale, Brett. Hey, I've got a relatively recent RPG story you might find interesting or usable for the channel. This is about the time my player character accidentally became the DM's BBEG. My group was playing Pathfinder 2nd Edition in a homebrew setting. The group consisted of an Orc Spirit Barbarian Psychopomp Sorcerer, me, the last shaman of the Orcs. His entire MO was protecting Orcish burial sites from necromancers and fighting against soldiers from the human empire that had destroyed his people. A very serious elf ranger druid with a bit of a greedy streak, and a mischievous gnome alchemist. She is extremely chaotic and tends to be the "I wonder what this big red button does" sort. Our party was hired by a retired adventurer to retrieve a super powerful magical artifact that we could use to end the continent-spanning war between the humans and elves, which had already more or less eradicated the orcs. After a few months of searching for it, we discover a key to the throne room of the ruined capital, an ancient haunted heart of a long-dead empire. As we travel there, we encounter an elven wizard and his war hero brother, searching for a powerful weapon in the ruined capital. Figuring on safety in numbers, we agree to work together to get there. A few weeks of bloody adventures fighting through the undead horde, mutant rat folk, and soldiers from the human empire, we get to the palace itself. During this dungeon crawl, the ranger finds numerous magic items, all very much cursed. Once we get to the throne room, our party stops to wonder about the elven brother's motivations. I cast Detect Alignment, Evil, and it came out that the elven wizard was super evil and a necromancer. Ruh-roh! His brothers seemed alright, so we hashed a plan to get rid of them. Since we had already retrieved the only key to this chamber, we pretended not to have it. The brothers became more frustrated, and our rations started to run low. When we were starting to get hungry, we convinced the war hero to leave and come back with heavy demolition gear to get through the door and to take his brother with him. We would guard the door so the Imperials don't come back and get the weapon. It worked! We enter the chamber, a mile-long hall with a terracotta army in neat ranks along the sides, a suit of armor dangling from chains high above the ground, and a map on the far wall. The map was our objective, a means to find the artifact. We decided we ought to check out the armor though, and operated both the winches to lower it to the ground. It was a blackened suit of plate armor that radiated powerful magic. No one in the party was proficient in heavy armor, but we figured we could either sell it for a huge sum, or give it to one of our allies. As we're looking at it, the gnome says, "I put the helmet on." Panic! We've seen how cursed the magic items hereabouts are. My barbarian tossed the breastplate on, reasoning that curse is normally required to be wearing the complete set. The ranger joins in, throwing on a gauntlet. All the better to dilute it further if it's cursed, right? Right? I'm gonna need will saves from everyone. Oh no. Gnome passes. Ranger passes. Barbarian does not pass. The armor locks into place, merging with his flesh. All the pieces still on the floor begin flying across the room to attach themselves to him. He spends hours battling the armor, smashing pieces speeding towards him, only for them to reform, peeling pieces off, flesh and all, only for them to fly back. Eventually, he bellows for the rest of the party to escape while they can. They leave and reseal the chamber as the stone soldiers are coming to life. This was extra powerful Grave Knight armor, comparable to Death Knights in D&D. This orc, who knew of all the massive orc burial places across the continent, knew of the locations of most necromantic covens across the continent, and was an expert on undeath, became a Grave Knight. The same Grave Knight armor that demolished the continent's previous civilization. That door seal was meant to keep people out rather than in, and proved no trouble to the newly risen Dreadcon. It came out later that the DM had planned for the elven wizard to dominate the war hero brother, and then turn him into the Grave Knight, conquering the continent while becoming the power behind the throne. The DM had been bummed that we'd accidentally prevented his big bad evil guy from coming into existence, until we accidentally created a much, much scarier and completely out of control version of the same later that session. And all because the gnome thought it'd be fun to put the helmet on. Hopefully you enjoyed the story. Brett, I did enjoy the story. Honestly, this sounds pretty epic. It's sad that you lost your character, but the DM obviously works on the fly and doesn't make the campaign about his story. I'd like to hear about how your party ended up stopping your character, so if you can, go ahead and write me back and fill me in. And this story is from Andrew Lockwood. He actually left his story in the comments of the first Big Boy Blue story. Well, if you want to wash your mouth out, here's a glory story. Feel free to make a video on it. TLDR, I, a 2-month newbie, break a 20-year veteran DM, or how I expanded the books used at the table. Back in August 2019, I, then 30 years of age, joined a D&D 5e group, having heard about it from the owner of a comic store. The group played in a room over the dude's store, and it was open to anyone who wanted to join. The DM had 20 plus years of experience and had served in the Marines until he was wounded in combat. The DM knew how to tell a story, and next session, I did up my first character, Variant Human Champion Fighter, Navarre, inspired by the character in Lady Hawk. Would love to build that guy someday. Also, most of the group had a disability of one sort or another. One was legally blind, one was born with just one arm, and others had their own issues. As for myself, high-functioning autism. Anyway, I'm the sort of person who, when really interested in something, does a lot of research into what I like. D&D 5e was no exception. It's an obsession, to be honest. I soon come across various helpful sites that discuss various races and subclasses not mentioned in the PHB. Well, whenever I mentioned them, the DM would go, "Do you have any proof it's official?" This is because the DM would say no to anything that was third party or homebrewed, but if you could prove that it was official Wizards of the Coast material by bringing in a book or PDF, he would be willing to allow it, once he looked it over, of course. Well, one day, about 2 months later, I had seen a certain YouTuber's class guide, the one whose characters always seem to have the entertainer background and play some sort of instrument, and I had heard about the Celestial Warlock as a result. Anyway, I mentioned the idea about a holy priest being a warlock to the DM. The DM thinks that it wouldn't work too well, due to gods and patrons being possessive and whatnot. So I go, what if the patron was a celestial? He said that it sounded homebrewed or third party, and that he'd never heard of such a thing over his 20 years, citing my 2-month experience. Well, I told him that I was sure that it was official. His response? Prove it! Well, gamers, support your local library, because they can find hidden treasures for you. In this case, Xanathar's Guide to Everything, and Volo's Guide to Monsters. Page 54 of Xanathar's has the Celestial Warlock. Next session, I showed the book to him. The group laughed at the idea of Unicorn Knights, but when the DM got to reading the powers of a Celestial Warlock, this guy, who has seen some things, including real evil, failed an intelligence or wisdom saving throw. Well, he set the book on the table first. He wasn't that far gone yet, and then did this 1,000-yard stare you see in those war movies, wherein one has heard some majorly bad news. One of the other players sitting across from him looked at me and said, "I think you broke him." He eventually made the saving throw, and gave me a look that was a mix of shock, awe, and respect. He got his own copy soon after. Sadly, 2020 being what it was, and with him moving, haven't played with him in a year. As for the rest of the group, most keep their distance, due to understandable reasons, and others seem to have lost interest. Still, I have hope, as I now own most of the books, adventure, campaign settings, supplemental, and so on. We'll see what happens. Might be able to reform the group. Here's a couple added tidbits. Shortly after the Celestial incident, I had managed to convince my mother, who had been taking me to the sessions, to join the group. Initially, I had wanted her to play as a kobold necromancer who had a skeleton servant carrying her everywhere. But lore-wise, necromancers wouldn't exactly work out too well. One had been the bad guy prior to my character joining, and the DM pointed out that a full-on spellcaster might be tricky for a new player. so he asked her if she'd be willing to do something else. My mother was. So, me and the DM went down the list of what we already had. Bard, 2 of them. Barbarian, Cleric, Fighter, Dwarf. Don't know what the Dwarf was. Doubt the Dwarf did either. Long story, involving negatives on his mental stats. Druid, until we got to... Monk? Tabaxi Monk! Tabaxi? Volos. I show the book and page to him, as I had that book already. The DM looks it over. Okay, I can work with this. Guy actually homebrewed an item that let Tabitha, Mother's character, use an added D4 on top of her martial arts die, D6 at the time, when making her attacks. Tidbit 2. After the group decided to hold off meeting during March 2020, DM's wife is an at-risk person. I soon got Wildmount. In it is the Hollow One, playable undead basically. I told him about it. The reason is, in story, we had a tiefling rogue who, after contracting 2 nasty sicknesses, had made a deal with the god of death, becoming the god's undead thrall basically. Anyway, upon me texting him about it, he asked, "Is it official Wizards of the Coast material?" Yes, it's official. I look forward to checking it out. Sadly, he ended up moving soon after this, but it was nice to see him be open to things not in the player's handbook. And I even send him info every so often. Maybe someday, a table will open up, and I'll sit down, look up, and there he'll be. That, or the other way around. Andrew, thank you for sharing your glory story. Hey, the DM asked for it, so you provided. Hopefully you guys will be able to reconnect one day and play some more games. Even with the distance, you might be able to pull off playing over Discord or Roll20. This story is shared by Koss, who also shared a story in this video here. Got a second glory story. So my party had a session in a dystopian world Pathfinder game. It was me being the gunslinger, 1 player as a mesmerist, and 1 more player as an elf. We started from different walks of life and ended up working together for a dragon that needed us to do a heist for them against a big company that owned the United States. It was Apple. The dragon gave us some funds and a way to get into the US. We come in early before the day of the heist into the United States, and instead of preparing for 3 months, we actually started businesses. I started a business in food service, and the mesmerist started a business selling wands and went from being in the poorhouse to being rich. The elf player, coming from a rich background, simply used his connections and means to make his business and based it in Montana before meeting up with me and the mesmerist. He then made a mobile forge in a van and was ready for the mission. While the days were passing in-game, I made a game and helped the mesmerist with his employees stealing wands from him, as he made a second shop in the bad part of town. I then took it upon myself to get the gear needed, a simple pest control van, and took it back to the safe house. On the day of the heist, it was almost a speed run, and after the DM heard the joke about us speedrunning it, she offered us a magical item if we could get it done within 20 or so rounds. We geared up, looking like exterminators, and went into their offices, and after I role-played my way out of having to make a bluff roll, the mesmerist, without thought, asked, "Don't you gotta make a bluff roll?" And we nearly got caught before we did anything, as me and the elf player's rolls weren't good enough with bluff, but the mesmerist managed to convince the first employee that we had reasons to be there. After getting past the first bluff roll, we did our best exterminator act, and sprayed poison around the first area, and worked our way out of the first building. Before I head out of the back, the DM tells me that I found a terminal that shows information about the corporation pouring tons of money into a project, and with a good old roll doubling the DC check, I became a billionaire in an instant. The 3 of us head outside, and we try to head to where we know the vault is to quickly finish the heist. But then, another employee flags us down and says he needs our help right now. We follow him, since we know we can't have the guy notice us open the back door to the vaults nearby. The employee leads us to this little building that has a number of electrified frogs hopping around. The elf player, thinking on his feet, tells the employee that we aren't equipped for this and that they should call the guards. At that same moment, a frog ate some ammunition and exploded next to me and the mesmerist. The mesmerist managed to get free of the explosion. I, on the other hand, get grazed and injured. Using my head, I decided to tell the employee that he should call the guards and explain that we're here to spray for bugs, not frogs. At this time, the employee gave me some first aid spray and let us go as the guards began going into the small building. The elf player ends up finding out the door leading to the back of the vault is an electronic lock, so he used Shocking Grasp on the lock, opening the door for us. Now comes the hardest part of the heist. We have a kobold drive the bug van down to us and block off sight of us trying to move the safes. The problem was when we tried to move the heavy safes. All three of us couldn't move them too well and had to do multiple strength rolls till the elf got the right roll and we put them in the van. We drive out of the Apple Plaza area and get stopped by security. We use my injury from the frog earlier as an excuse and say that our contract allows us to use the hospital, and the guy lets us go. When we get back to the safe house, we watch the news and hear about our work. Since I wanted no traces back to us, I ended up going to a library. At the library, I managed to make a digital footprint leaving a trail to some low-level workers that worked for Apple. Then, I got a nefarious idea that made the session. I asked if I could make the leader of the heist be someone from another corporation. The DM told me sure, and asked which one. I then tell them the one that owns the country I'm from, Sony. They tell me to roll, and I got a nat 20 and somewhat regret it. The nat 20 was so high that I managed to start a war between those two corporations. These two corporations that have so much power that they own countries. Before the session ended, there was another news story that said that war was declared. The elven player asked me what did I do, and I told him I didn't do a thing. My character even got a call from his wife, and when I explained to her I couldn't come home at the moment, she was just like the elven player, asking what I did. I promised to tell her everything when I got back, but tried to tell her I didn't do anything. Cass, thank you for sharing your tale. Sounds like it was a pretty fun heist. Glad you were all able to pull it off, even though you didn't do anything. Well everyone, I hope you enjoyed this break. It's nice to just sit back and enjoy some of these stories. If you want to hear a few other glory stories, you can click on this playlist here. Or, if you're ready for more degeneracy, go ahead and click on this video here. Be sure to leave me a like if you enjoyed. That's gonna do it for today. And until next time, hope you feel inspired.